Years ago, a 90-year-old woman talked to me, telling me about her son, her oldest son, being in the hospital with incurable cancer. When I asked her about the son, I said, well, I didn't know you had another son. His name was Victor. And she said, well, Victor used to love God. We had him in church all the time. He wanted to be a preacher. He went off to a Christian college, and then he was drafted and went to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, he lost his faith in God. He became a drug addict. And I said, well, tell me the hospital he's in and I'll go see him. She said, well, you can't go see him. He hates preachers. And I said, well, what's the big deal about that? I had to admit that every time I got dressed in the morning, every morning I usually got dressed before I went to work. That was a good thing to do to keep your job and to keep from being in jail. So every morning when I got dressed, one of my goals was I didn't want to look like a preacher. I just wanted to be a real person, right? No offense to preachers. The worst thing that would happen would he'd kick me out of his room. So anyway, I went up to the hospital to see him. I go in the room, and this guy is members of the Hells Angels. Okay, he had this long beard. He had food scattered throughout his beard. He had a bandana on. He had tubes off. He was in the hospital in pretty bad shape, and he had a friend with him named Harold, and Harold had the leather on, the leather look, the chains look, the Hells Angels jacket. Harold looked worse than Victor, to be honest. Harold had most of his teeth missing, like 31 or 32 of them. When I walked in the room, that's what I saw. And I said, are you Victor? And he said, yeah, I'm Victor. Who are you? And I said, my name's David. And he said, who sent you? Did my mom send you? And if my mom sent you, you must be a preacher. And if you're a preacher, I don't want anything to do with you. And he used other choice words I'm not going to use in this video. And he told me to get the blank out of his room. So I asked him about Harold, and he said, well, Harold is my best friend in life. And if you don't think you'll be in trouble if you don't get out of this room, I'll sick Harold on you. And if you don't believe that, just ask the prisoners he used to be in prison with. They'll tell you they were all afraid of Harold. And so I stayed and talked with him. And we talked about Detroit Pistons, Detroit Tigers, Detroit Red Wings, Detroit Lions, because he was a sports nut and he had ESPN on in his room all the time. So my first visit with him, I said, Victor, do you mind if I pray with you? Never in my preaching life had I ever been refused praying with somebody. When I asked that question, that was the first time. Victor said, you will not pray for me. I forbid it. I don't have God in my life. I don't want God in my life. I don't believe in God. So get the blank out of this room and never come back. I said, so you think you can keep me from praying for you? He said, you will not pray. And I said, I will. I'll go outside the room right now and I'll go in the hallway and I'll pray. And what I wanted to do is go out there and pray real loud. God, be with the rudest, ugliest man I've ever seen in my life. Be with Victor. Reevaluating the worst thing that could happen to me, I went out and I prayed for Victor in the hallway, but I prayed silently that prayer. Be with Victor, the rudest and ugliest guy I've ever known. So anyway, that started the relationship between Victor and me. So I would say once every 2 weeks or so, when he was in the hospital, I'd go visit Victor. We'd talk about sports, and we started to kind of develop a relationship. And I'd say, Victor, do you mind if I pray with you before I go? And he'd cuss at me and say no, and tell me to get out of the room. He would get out of the hospital, and he would get better a little bit. He was on chemo, and then he'd go back in the hospital. One of those things, many of you have been through that with a loved one, I'm sure. And so many months passed, and I had not visited Victor in probably 2 or 3 months. And his mother called me. David, we're back in the hospital. The doctors say Victor will never come out of his coma. He will die at any minute. Could you please pray? And I said, well, we'll come up there to be with you. So Debbie and I drove to the hospital. We went in the room. And as we were going to the room, Julia, his mother, came running out to us. And she came out and said, David, Victor is awake and he wants to see you. And the doctors say sometimes before death, people will have a surge of energy and wake up a little bit, and he did. In fact, he could talk. And I went in the room and I held his hand. I said, Victor, I want you to know I love you. And he said, I love you too. And then I said, Victor, I want you to know one more thing. God loves you. And he said, David, God couldn't love me. And all of a sudden he spoke clearly. He said, if you only knew what I have done in my life, you would know why God could not love me. I said, Victor, I do know what you've done. Your mother's told me all about it. And he kind of winced. A little uncomfortableness there, because the people in that room that's going to spend his last few moments of life with knew what a scoundrel he had been. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've been hopeless. Victor felt pretty hopeless at that moment. Death was knocking on the door. And I said, Victor, do you know the story of the thief on the cross? See, Victor used to preach and he loved God with all his heart, and he was genuine in his faith, and he goes to Vietnam, and he has visions of killing people and losing friends and people dying all around him and getting hooked on drugs, and God became his enemy because, you see, Victor couldn't believe anybody could love him. And he knew the story of the thief on the cross. And I said, well, I'm going to remind you of that story, that thief that deserved to die because of his criminal activity in his time. And he was sentenced to die on that cross. And he asked Jesus to remember him when he came to his kingdom. And he saw something about Jesus that indicated maybe it's not too late. Maybe you can have hope. And Jesus uttered those words we all know, most of us know, today you will be with me in paradise, indicating that Jesus forgave this guy on the cross. And that guy hadn't done anything except ask. When I told Victor that story and reminded him of that story in the thief, the tears started coming down his face. And then he said those words, David, would you mind praying for me that somehow God could forgive me of all my sins? And I don't know what your theology is. I don't have all the answers. But my theology says that God's mercy and love last forever. And we are hard-pressed to even understand a tenth of it. And I said to Victor, I know you've been hurt, and I know you've done some crazy stuff in your life, but I do know this, that God loves you. But God's forgiveness has nothing to do with my prayer. All you have to do is ask for it. So I'm not going to pray for God to forgive you. I'm going to thank God for forgiving you, because God sees your heart right now and your desire to be right with him and to be forgiven. So I prayed. And I thank God for sending Victor into our lives and for sending Jesus to die for people like Victor and like David and like you. He died an hour later. I had read the story of the thief on the cross. I'd preached on it for years, but I'd never seen it until the day I was holding a crusty old Hell's Angel motorcycle gang, bearded reprobate. One reprobate, me, holding another reprobate's hand, Victor. And I found out what God's all about that day. You see, Victor died that day. His name really was Victor. And he had victory all over his face when he died. Spark of Life, we believe in hope, even when you're to the point of hopelessness and helplessness and there's no way out. We believe in hope because we've seen it. We believe in victory in the midst of loss. Wherever you are on the spectrum of no hope to fully hopeful today, we want you to know that as long as you're breathing, there is hope. At Spark of Life, there is always hope. So join us. Go to sparkoflife.org. We're there for you. We have people standing by. We want to walk beside you on this journey. When you feel hopeless and helpless, let somebody help you. At Spark of Life, there's always hope.